I was 38 years old the last time my mother introduced me to a table of relatives as my disgrace. 14 words. I counted them out of habit, the way I count everything. That habit is the whole reason this story ends the way it does. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my working life finding the number that a person hoped no one would ever look at twice. So when my mother said those 14 words over a plate of green bean casserole, something in me did what it always does with numbers that don't add up. It filed the moment away. Exhibit 1. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts, and family finally learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because this one has a number in it you will not forget. My father used to call me the ledger. Not unkindly. He meant that I balanced things. Even as a kid, I noticed when someone got the bigger slice and someone got the burnt end, and I noticed that in my house, I was always handed the burnt end and expected to say thank you. He married my mother young, and by the time I was born, the marriage had already settled into its permanent shape. My father working, my mother spending, and a golden child forming in the space between them. My brother Marcus arrived 4 years after me, and from the moment he could smile on command, the household rearranged itself around him like furniture around a chandelier. I don't say any of this with bitterness. I say it the way I'd describe a balance sheet. Assets here, liabilities there, and a persistent, decades-long transfer of resources in one direction. My mother was not cruel to me in dramatic ways. She was cruel the way erosion is cruel. A comment here. A joke at a party there. A quiet redirection of praise, every single time, toward Marcus. My father was the one steady column in the equation. He was an engineer, careful and unshowy. The kind of man who wrote thank you notes in pen and remembered everyone's coffee order. He used to sit with me at the kitchen table on Sunday nights and go over my report cards line by line, and he never once compared me to my brother. When he died, heart attack, 41 days before my 38th birthday, I lost the only person in that family who had ever balanced my ledger without being asked. The emotional arithmetic of my family ran like this. I showed up. I paid. I absorbed. I fixed. When my mother's roof needed replacing, I found the contractor and split the cost with my father, quietly off the books. When Marcus's second business failed, I was the one who drove out at 11 at night to help him move his equipment out before the landlord changed the locks. And every year, at every gathering, my mother introduced me the same way to anyone who hadn't heard it yet. This is my daughter, Vanessa. The disgrace. Then a laugh, light as a hors d'oeuvre, meant to signal that it was a joke, the kind of joke you're not allowed to react to without seeming humorless. She'd been saying it since I was 26, since the year I left my first marriage instead of enduring it. She never explained what, exactly, disgraced her. She just found new occasions to say it. The specific evening this story is built around was a Thursday, October the 9th. 6 weeks after my father's funeral, my mother hosted what she called a small gathering to honor his memory. At her house with the extended family, the kind of dinner where everyone brings a dish and somebody's aunt cries into the mashed potatoes. I brought the wine and the folder. I always bring a folder. It's a professional habit. I don't walk into any room involving money without documentation, and a memorial dinner 6 weeks after a man's death, in this particular family, was absolutely a room involving money. At the table, my mother stood to make a toast. She thanked everyone for coming, said a few soft things about my father that sounded borrowed from a card, and then, glass raised, eyes bright with performance, she said the line. And of course my daughter Vanessa is here. The family disgrace, God love her, always so serious about everything. Laughter around the table. Someone's cousin actually clinked a glass in agreement. I did not react. I picked up my fork. I ate a bite of the casserole I had not made, and I let the moment pass the way you let a bad transaction pass on a page you intend to reconcile later. Because 6 weeks earlier, in a conference room with beige walls and a box of tissues no one had touched, I had learned something my mother did not yet know I knew. My father's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Harold Weiss, had called me in for what he described as a reading of specific bequests, separate from the general estate meeting. Everyone else, my mother Marcus, my mother's sister Denise, had attended a different earlier meeting, the one where the house, the joint accounts, and the visible parts of my father's life were divided in the way everyone expected. But there was a second document. A trust, established 11 years earlier, funded quietly and continuously with a portion of my father's engineering consulting income. Income my mother didn't know existed, because my father had never told her about the side contracts he took on after hours. The trust held $612,000. The sole beneficiary was me. Harold read the trust document aloud, and then he set a second, smaller envelope on the table. He asked me to give you this separately, he said. He wrote it about 4 years ago. He updated it once after your divorce, but the core of it never changed. The letter was 1 page handwritten, and I have read it more times than I can count, but there is one line from it I will carry for the rest of my life. He wrote, "You were never the disgrace in that house. You were just the only one keeping score." I read the letter 3 times before I moved. Then I photographed it, filed the original in a fireproof lockbox, and drove home in silence. For 6 weeks, I said nothing. I let my mother continue to believe what she had always believed, that whatever money existed would flow the way money in that family always flowed, downhill toward Marcus and pooling wherever my mother stood. I watched her make plans out loud. I watched Marcus, at a Sunday lunch 2 weeks after the funeral, mention, casually like weather, that he was probably going to use some of the estate money to finally get the restaurant idea off the ground. Nobody at that table had offered him $1. He had simply assumed it, the way you assume gravity. My mother started referring to when things settle, in a tone that implied a windfall. She mentioned twice that she thought it was only right that the house be transferred fully into her name, even though my father's will already handled that cleanly, given everything I put up with these 30 years. She began speaking about my father's assets as though narrating a will she had never actually read the fine print of. 3 days before the October dinner, Marcus came to my apartment unannounced. He stood in my doorway in a jacket that cost more than his last 2 rent payments combined and told me, with the specific gentleness of a man asking for money, that he'd heard from someone at the bank that Dad might have had some kind of side account. He wanted to know if I knew anything about it. I asked him one question. Why would you need to know that before probate closes? He didn't have an answer. He left 10 minutes later, and I called Harold that same night. I said 4 words. Send the letters now. Harold filed the formal notice of the separate trust with the estate the following morning, which meant that by the time my mother stood up with her wineglass on October 9th and called me a disgrace in front of 11 relatives, the paperwork proving otherwise was already sitting, notarized, in 3 separate mailboxes across town. Hers, Marcus's, and Denise's, set to arrive the next day. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon suddenly find all the time in the world the moment money enters the room, you already know exactly where this goes. Stick with me. I let the dinner finish. I helped clear plates. I said goodnight, thanked my mother for hosting, and told her I'd see her Saturday, because Saturday was her 63rd birthday, and she had already texted the family group chat insisting everyone come, adding, in a message I screenshotted without a second thought, "We have things to discuss now that your father's affairs are wrapping up." I arrived on Saturday with a bottle of her favorite Sancerre, and a slim black folder tucked inside my bag. The dining room had been rearranged for a toast. Marcus stood at the head of the table, not my mother, Marcus, and I understood immediately that this was not a birthday party. This was a verdict being delivered as a formality, the family's version of a closing argument before anyone had opened the case file. Marcus raised his glass. He talked about how hard the last 2 months had been. He talked about moving forward as a family and honoring Dad's real wishes, a phrase he used twice, and each time he said it, my mother nodded like a woman ratifying a bill. Then he said the part I'd been waiting for. And I think we all agree the house and whatever's left should stay where it makes sense, with Mom, and with rebuilding what our family's lost. A soft round of approving murmurs. Denise dabbed her eyes. Someone's cousin actually applauded. My mother turned to me and in front of everyone, asked if I had anything to add. She asked it the way you ask a defendant if they'd like to say a few words before sentencing. She expected silence or tears or the quiet capitulation I'd offered my entire life. I asked for the floor. She gave it to me, smiling, certain I was about to surrender. I opened the folder. I started with the smallest item, because that's how you do it. You never lead with your strongest evidence. You build a floor under the room first. I read the date of the trust's establishment. 11 years ago, I said, before any of us knew Dad was doing consulting work on the side. I read the current balance. $612,000, I said, exactly, because round numbers invite doubt and precise numbers don't. I watched my mother's face do the thing a balance sheet does when a number won't reconcile. A small, involuntary recalculation behind the eyes. Then I read Marcus's own words back to him. I think we all agree the house and whatever's left should stay where it makes sense. I told the table that there was, in fact, no whatever's left to discuss, because the funds in question had never been part of the general estate, and had never, at any point, belonged to anyone at that table but me. The room went soft first, a confused murmur, someone asking if this was a joke. Then it went emotional. My mother's voice cracked, insisting my father would never have cut his own family out, would never have kept something like that from her. I answered that in one sentence. He didn't keep it from the family. He kept it from you specifically, and he wrote down why. Then it went loud. Marcus stood up, said I'd always been jealous, always needed to make everything about being wronged, that I was, in his words, twisting a nice family dinner into a courtroom. I let him finish. Calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had confused the two my entire life, and this was the moment that distinction finally became visible to everyone at that table. Then it went threatening. My mother said, in a voice gone thin and sharp, that if this was how I wanted to play it, she would make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of daughter does this to her own mother at a birthday dinner. I told her that was a fair trade, since she'd spent 12 years telling everyone exactly what kind of daughter she thought I already was. Then finally it went silent, because I set the letter on the table. I didn't read all of it aloud. I read one line, the one I already knew by heart, in the same flat, even voice I used to read a subpoenaed bank statement. You were never the disgrace in that house. You were just the only one keeping score. I let it sit on the tablecloth between the gravy boat and the birthday cake, in my father's handwriting, dated and notarized, requiring no further explanation from me at all. Denise didn't defend my mother. She looked at the letter for a long moment, then looked at her own hands, and said quietly that she'd always thought the disgrace thing had gone too far. It wasn't an apology, and it didn't need to be one. I acknowledged it with a nod. It didn't earn her anything back. Some debts of complicity don't get forgiven just because someone finally notices them out loud. Before I left, my mother asked, not shouted, asked, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from her, what I intended to do now. I picked up my folder, my letter, my wine untouched on the table, and I told her the only sentence I'd prepared in advance. I'm going to do exactly what he asked. Keep the ledger balanced. Then I left the table where I had been called a disgrace for the last time in my life. The estate closed 4 months later. The house, as my father's actual will specified, passed to my mother outright, debt-free. He had provided for her fairly, in the open, the way a man does when he intends to be seen doing right by someone. Marcus received his stated share of the general estate, $40,000, which he used, within 6 weeks, as a down payment on the restaurant lease he had already promised to 3 different vendors before probate even closed. The trust, the $612,000, remained entirely mine, exactly as my father intended, untouched by a single conversation at that dinner table. Marcus's restaurant lasted 11 months. I heard about the closing from Denise, who still calls me twice a year, mostly out of guilt, I think, though I've stopped needing to know which. My mother and I speak rarely now, and when we do, she has never again introduced me as anything at all. She simply doesn't introduce me. I've decided that's an improvement. The letter lives in the same fireproof lockbox as the original trust documents, though I had it professionally preserved, archival sleeve, acid-free, the kind of thing you do for something you intend to keep for the rest of your life and possibly hand to a daughter of your own one day. I don't take it out often. I don't need to. I know the line by heart, and some evidence doesn't need repeated viewing to keep its verdict. With a portion of the trust, I did the one thing that had nothing to do with any of them. I funded a scholarship in my father's name at the engineering school he'd attended on a partial scholarship himself, 40 years earlier, for students who work full-time while finishing their degrees, the kind of quiet, unglamorous circumstance nobody throws a toast for. It isn't revenge. It's the ledger, finally balanced in the direction he always meant it to go. I don't think of what happened at that dinner table as getting even. I think of it the way I think of any correction on a set of books that were never accurate to begin with. I simply stopped making payments on a debt I never actually agreed to carry. Being quiet was never the same as owing something. It only looked that way to people who'd never had to read the fine print of their own family. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.